So our next presenters will be Brian Michael Lione and Jessica S. Johnson. Brian Michael Lione manages the International Cultural Heritage Protection Program at the Smithsonian's Museum Conservation Institute, MCI. In addition to his Iraq work, Brian serves on the Smithsonian's Rural Working Group and supports training in anti-trafficking for US law enforcement and training and response needs for international and domestic emergencies. Jessica S. Johnson is the head of conservation at the Smithsonian Institution's Museum Conservation Institute, the MCI. An objects conservator, she has been working in northern Iraq on cultural heritage projects since 2009 and helped establish the Iraq Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil. Prior to her work in Iraq, she worked at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian and helped to set up the inaugural exhibits for the Mall Museum. In 2014, she returned to the Smithsonian, bringing along projects and interest in supporting Iraq's continued cultural heritage recovery and long-term preservation. And both Brian and Jessica will be talking today about building capacity for preparedness and response in Iraq, lessons from the classroom and from the field, 2009 to 2024. Welcome both, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I thank our organizers for inviting us to speak about, what's been a passion of both Brian and me for, since 2009. So what you'll be hearing today is an overview of the work that Brian and I have done in partnership. We've been both involved in this together since 2009. But the work's been supported by numerous individuals and institutions here in the US, in Iraq, and from elsewhere. So many people have supported and collaborated on this project. So we're here presenting a number of individuals in the US and Iraq, and as well as funding institutions. And we give our great thanks to all of them. So if I could have the next slide, please. What I'd like you to take away today from this presentation is an understanding of the goals of the original project, which developed into an actual building that you see here, which is located in Erbil, Iraq. And within that building, we and many others have supported years of educational programs. It goes by the long-winded name, the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage. We tend to call it the Iraqi Institute. Others call it ICHIP and ICA and other things like that. So you may have heard it referred to by a number of different names. Brian's going to then talk about, after I give the overview, Brian will talk about recent and upcoming projects that we've been doing through the Smithsonian. And then we'll end with a few thoughts on the successes and difficulties we've had over the course of the last 14 years. So the Iraqi Institute was initiated in 2009 as part of the Iraq Cultural Heritage Project, which was developed by the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, the Cultural Heritage Center there, and in collaboration with the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage of the Iraqi Ministry of Culture. Early in the project, the building that you see here, which was the original public library, was donated by the Kurdistan Regional Government, and to this day is managed under the responsibility of the Erbil Governor's Office. The day-to-day management of the Institute is conducted under Director Dr. Abdullah Khorshid since 2011. He's also an archaeology professor at the local Salahuddin University, and there are some paid staff who have been transferred for other departments of the Kurdistan Regional Government and the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage. Other support for programs there comes from other heritage offices, which have always supported individuals when they attend courses, some of which are weeks long. At our longest, we had a 30-week, 2-level collections care and management program. So next slide, please. The educational programs that we have taught at the Institute were originally developed in consultation with representatives from U.S. museums and educational institutions in collaboration with the Iraqi Museum, the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, and the U.S. Embassy. So in the early development of the programs, Iraqi and American advisors advocated strongly for the establishment of conservation education programs in Iraq, partly because of the failure of other programs where they were bringing Iraqis out to try to do training. But they wanted the training to be tailored to Iraqi needs, but taught at a level that met international standards. So we had advisors from a number of the educational conservation programs here in the U.S. They wanted these courses to avoid the pitfalls of disjointed short courses. So courses tend to be several months in length, and that promoted communication and critical thinking skills. So this approach guides our projects to this day. They're very practical, but have a deep analytical and theoretical perspective as well. So between 2009 and 2013, 3 basic programs were developed. Archaeological site management, collections care and conservation, and architectural conservation. The programs were managed under the University of Delaware from 2011 to 2014 at the Iraqi Institute, but the Institute also supported training initiatives from other countries and international NGOs, including the Czech Republic, Italy, Poland, Germany, and the World Monuments Fund. Next slide. So this is a picture with a number of students involved in a number of different projects, both on site and in the lab. The main participants for programs at the Iraqi Institute have been cultural heritage practitioners. These are people who already have jobs related to documenting, preserving, and conserving cultural heritage. All have at least an undergraduate degree. Most of them have degrees in archaeology, but a few have had architecture, engineering, and a few other topics as their degree. Most of the students, as we call them when they're at the Institute, have jobs in antiquities departments from across Iraq, but there have been students who work for universities, museums under other directorates that aren't archaeology, and we've even had a few individuals that were involved in mass graves recovery. During this time, we identified top students who have been who still continue to work at the Institute. We call them master trainers. They're assistant teachers who support the instructors and who are now doing their own training programs at the Institute or in their home offices. And as I said, direct support under the University of Delaware continued until 2014. I just want to point out in the upper left-hand corner, that's one of our master trainers working on site at the Citadel in Erbil, outside of the laboratory and teaching. Okay, next slide. Then in 2015, after ISIS incursions, our training shifted more towards first aid, the kinds of training that have been developed by our colleagues in the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative and at ICOM. The first aid training, as ISIS has been pushed out, we've now taken this first aid training and along with other changes and recommendations to the programs, have incorporated that into a more introductory Fundamentals of Heritage Conservation program, which began in 2016. And this fundamentals course includes topics that support all kinds of cultural heritage preservation and incorporates parts of all the 3 earlier collections, architecture, and archaeological site programs. So with that overview of what we were doing up until about 2015-16, I'll let Brian take over and talk about our more specific site recovery efforts.
Thank you, Jessie. So as we've seen in the overview, we started out with this capacity building model and really spending a lot of time on site with an extensive number of people, both Iraqi partners on site with us, helping to initiate and then maintain the Iraqi Institute. But as you saw in that pivot, if you will, to this more concern about disaster preparedness and response, specifically in preparedness and response to the threat of ISIS or Daesh coming into Iraq, there were expanded needs beyond the classroom, if you will. And so we were approached in early 2017 by the then head of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage to see if we could extend beyond the classroom and take some of the site preparedness and response methodology and help to specifically recover certain sites. And so the Nimrud Rescue Project at that point was born, in which we came up with this recovery methodology that Jesse had mentioned that we had been doing in a classroom, and taught a specific team, the Nimrud Rescue Team, about 30 Iraqi archaeologists and heritage professionals from the Nineveh Provincial Office of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, taught them this methodology in the classroom at the Iraqi Institute in Erbil throughout 2017 and 2018, and then sent them out into the field, purchased supplies and equipment, and then provided site-specific subject matter expertise as they did the work. And frankly, quickly, they far surpassed all the training that they had in their classroom and expanded beyond the initial idea of recovering just small areas of Nimrud, which was so drastically detonated by ISIS previous to this. And to this day, they're now working, they're in their fourth recovery season, they're finishing that up and working on a fifth. The methodology at Nimrud, which of course is this massive site, tell site, was to look at a 10 by 10 meter grid square and then picking up the materials in a prioritized fashion, documenting that recovery and safe storing them in purpose-built storage at the site as we think about and plan longer term with other partners beyond kind of the immediate recovery, what happens to the site long term, what other Iraqi regional and international partners can we bring in to help support the recovery and eventual reopening of the site. So with that methodology, a 10 by 10 meter grid square, it was almost easy, if you will, to shrink that down to a 2 by 2 meter grid square at the Mosul Cultural Museum. We were asked in 2019 to help with the immediate assessment of damage at the site, which we did in a recovery mission in early 2019 with Iraqi partners and others, to go in and do the photographic documentation needed, forensic level documentation needed to establish all of the damage in situ as it was when we arrived. And then a subset of that Nimrud rescue team, that's the same province, was able to go in and work up a plan to address each of the galleries at the museum, room by room, if you will, on a 2 by 2 grid, and then doing the same methodology of recovering things in a prioritized fashion, documenting it, and safe storing it. We helped with those recovery missions, and then that led to conservation activities, which are to this day being led by the Louvre, and now the building rehabilitation, which is being led by the World Monuments Fund. And when I say led, these are the foreign partners that have the specific expertise to bring to this, but I can't establish or in fact enforce enough how important it is to us that the Iraqi partners that we've worked with many years are doing the work themselves and receiving assistance from their international partners. So thinking about how we were able to work on this kind of train and assist mission and then pivoting again as the international COVID pandemic took hold, we had to move away from this idea of some training and sending people out into the field and move completely away from the idea of training people in classrooms and move to a virtual capacity building model. And so just two of the things that we've been working on at the Smithsonian over the last few years. Fundamentals in Heritage Conservation, which was a course that we've been teaching at the Iraqi Institute for many years. We worked with the director of the Institute and our master trainers, our teaching assistants, on putting together a short series of videos of key heritage topics that we then had translated into English, Arabic, and Kurdish and subtitled. And in this way, people can get an idea, particularly non-specialists, of fundamentals in heritage conservation and then reach out to the Institute and make that connection. And then this last project I want to highlight as a capacity building effort is is the Treasures of Mesopotamia, which is an online exhibit receiving funding from our embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, to work with the Iraq National Museum and the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage and come up with an online exhibit of the treasures, of a small group of kind of the highlights of the Iraq National Museum's collection. But to do that, of course, we had to rewind and start from the very beginning. And what you see here is a few pages, the cover and a few pages of the interpretive master plan, and thinking through exhibit design, and thinking through themes, and thinking through the best pieces from the collection that would demonstrate and help to tell that story overall within that exhibit. So this is a document that we finished. This was an iterative process which lent itself well to meeting with Iraqi partners on a monthly basis, sometimes multiple times over the month, and working with different parts of the museum and State Board staff to bring together this online exhibit. And we've now moved beyond this, and we're looking at some additional training and collaboration longer term with the same group to help do some museum studies training, which we'll talk about next. The museum studies as a discipline, as we know it in the US, is not a course that yet really exists in the Iraq higher education system. So we've been working on designing a course with some of our Smithsonian and other partners, and that's something that we'll be delivering in 2025 for that same cohort of people from the Iraq Museum, National Museum, and the State Board, with whom we work to do that interpretive master plan. So you have that online piece of designing and working in committee fashion, but now we're going to do an in-person piece for that cohort as well. And then we hope to adapt that program and then specifically focus on museum professionals from the Mosul Cultural Museum as that building is rehabilitated and getting closer and closer to being reopened in the next few years. The staff are working on coming up to speed on not only their roles within the larger framework of the museum itself, but also better understanding other aspects of the museum and how it works. So you can see kind of an overarching arc here of the work that Jesse and I and many others have been doing since 2009, and projects that have been funded since 2008 and really in progress on paper anyway since probably 2006 and 2007. And so as we think back and look at some of these things that we've been doing, lessons learned it seems almost trite. I don't want to just assume that the lessons that we've learned after 15, 16 years are something that you all should pay specific attention to and learn. So rather than do a lessons learned, it's more some thoughts and some suggestions, because in any of these kind of bespoke long-term capacity building efforts, there's a lot of compromise that's being made. There's a lot of dynamic environments, either security, political, or funding environments that drive and dictate both needs and outcomes. And so just a few simple things that we've picked up on that are really the foundation, if you will, just the core, the basis of all the work that we try to do in Iraq. We do try to prioritize in-person work whenever possible. That is despite where we've all come so far since COVID in terms of online work. Particularly for classroom work, there is no substitution for working in person with our Iraqi colleagues. There's the model that we use at the Iraqi Institute tends to be a 20% theory and 80% hands-on practical. And the theory itself, of course, could be delivered by Zoom or online, but really doing something in person for practical can be a real challenge, of course, if we're not there in person. We're very fortunate that we've worked with the director of the Institute and the master trainers of the Institute, that a lot of the hands-on work, particularly in times when we were unable to travel to Iraq, be for pandemic reasons or security reasons, we were able to collaborate with our colleagues there, and they would implement some of the teaching, the classroom, and specifically the laboratory teaching themselves. So committing to this long-term collaboration, you see a real connection to our Iraqi colleagues, and you see the same colleagues over and over and over again, the same offices mentioned, and it's just this all seems very obvious, right? We can't just go in and do one project for a few weeks and expect to affect real change. Over the last 15, 16 years, I would like to think that these programs, this whole collection of programs that are centered on the Iraqi Institute, not just those that are led by the Smithsonian, but by others in and outside of Iraq, have really completely changed and evolved, if you will, the cultural heritage practice writ large of the entire country of Iraq. We have moved the needle, as we would say, collaboratively, collectively, on looking at the cultural heritage management needs across the country and addressing them. It is that long view as funding priorities do change. Our funders we've been very, very fortunate to receive funding from our U.S. Department of State, be that through the Cultural Heritage Center and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, as Jesse mentioned, but also our embassy in Baghdad and the consulate in Erbil. They have been consistent funders, but looking at private funding, as many of you, I'm sure, know, what funders would like to fund changes from time to time. And so there needs to be some flexibility on the part of the partners and the implementers. So our Iraqi colleagues have learned, as have we, as we've gone through this over the years, to be as flexible as possible. It, again, should go without saying, but to build partnerships, even if they take longer, even if they are not necessarily as high impact and on paper as effective as they might be, but doing things that are less prescriptive and more based in partnerships. Leading by example, simply we say we're going to show up and do projects, and we continue to say that, and we continue to show up and do projects. And it's that commitment, it's that long-term commitment to our partners in Iraq that I think is a real piece of our huge success with this large partnership that we formed. And then a final note, it's you work with the resources you can get locally, not with the resources you'd like to have. Conservation supplies is not really particularly easy to get in Iraq, and equipment is difficult to find, it's difficult to maintain. So working with low-tech, no-tech approaches and high-tech approaches where you can find them and sustain them, but starting with what you've got versus what you might want to have. And with that, I'll end. You see our contact information there at the bottom. I just want to remind you, of course, of the question and answer period and then the breakout room later on at, I think, 4:20 and 4:45, respectively. We'd be happy to answer questions at that time and discuss more. So thank you all for your attention and your participation, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, Brian and Jessica, and I'm sure there will be again lots of reactions, comments, questions. Please do put them in the Slido, which will be monitored and worked on, and then in our Q&A session after the next presentation, we can ask these questions. Thank you both again. Our next speaker is Dr. Deepakshi Sharma. She is currently working as an archivist at Dedicated Freight Corridor Corporation of India Limited, Ministry of Railways Enterprise. Previously, she has worked extensively as museum consultant at National Rail Museum, New Delhi. Dr. Sharma has been awarded with various fellowships, grants for performing technical work and presenting her research work at various international conferences. Concurrently, 12 research papers and 2 posters have been published at international as well as national journals. At the International Forum, she is serving as a fellowship committee member of IIC and even working actively as coordinator for the ICOM-CC working group Sculpture, Polychromy and Architectural Decorations. And Dr. Sharma will be welcome, and her talk is entitled, she will be talking about implementation on the ICOM-FAR training in practice. Welcome, Deepakshi, and please take the floor.
Good afternoon over there and good evening from here. Namaste from India. And I'm Deepakshi, and I'm working with the Ministry of Railways as a museum consultant and archivist. So today my topic is about the journey which I've covered during my training course with ICOM. So I'm sure in the audience, most of you knows about ICOM, but with every slides going ahead, I would be able to tell you how we started from online learning, and it has actually transformed us, most of us. And I could see a lot of people from my course hearing me in the audience. So here I go. So before working here, I was working at the National Rail Museum, which is one of the finest museum in our country, and it's all about the name says it. It's all about railways, rail. So about the course, as I said, that it was led by ICOM Park-Olasia, and the course name was International Course on Rethinking Disaster Risk Management for Cultural Heritage Collections, and we did it in during the times of. It started in 2020. And to be frank, it was when I enrolled for this course, I was a little skeptical that how are we going to learn through online learning. But by the end of the course, we were all so confident. We were evolved like a museum professionals. We kind of started thinking in that way that one person should do at the time of planning for DRM, things like that. So we were introduced the concept of scenario-based planning that enabled all participants to take proactive preventive measures. We were also helped in developing realistic scenarios. We are all aware of disasters. We are all aware of how it can lead to in any of the organization. But realizing it in a realistic scenario, I could be able to understand through this course. So the course structure was aimed to develop multi-hazard disaster risk. For example, if there's an earthquake and there is a fire breakout along with it. So it's about not thinking about single hazard disaster risk, but a multi-hazard disaster risk. And it empowered 20 heritage professionals by enhancing their ability to better understand disaster risk. And in total, 16 participants implemented field projects by the end of the course. So in 12 countries and all. What was the goal of this course? It made us understand the different hazards. What could be the frequency? What could be the magnitude of our sites? How we should expose, what would be the likely routes that can identify hazard. So so there were phases of the training. We had 3 phases in all. So we started off with the first phase. It was a 2-week online learning, and it started in December 2020. Like I said, that this was first of its kind because it was a remote learning session, and we were 20 of us, and on the first day we met through online and we kind of gelled with each other. It was an online workshop which featured learning activities, short lectures. We were also given a role play. For example, one person playing the role of a director and the other person is playing a role of a fireman. So how one should react at the time of emergency, how one should prepare for the emergency. It was being taught from the day one. We were also, this was a formula, like I don't have to go well in the details of the term, but disaster risk is all about hazard, exposure, vulnerabilities, and capacities. So when all coming together, it can create an impact. So it can either lead to a loss or damage. And if it remain unattended, it will lead to another new risk. Again, the hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, of course, if they all goes down and if we have high capacity then the risk will be manageable. But if it is the other way around, then it is going to be a problem. So the first exercise which we were being taught was the value pie. If you're in an organization, you know the organization, you know the collection. So when I was given this task, I was being asked that how many galleries do you have? So we have one outdoor which has life-size, big-size locomotives, all those collection. And then we also have indoor exhibits. which includes a history section and all related sections. So then I was being asked that if you know that you have a section, then you must be knowing that what value they all carry. So divide your collections as per the value. So I made a chart, and the outdoor exhibits are all being exhibited as per the gauges. So we have, if I've given broad gauge 20%, so that means we have collections over there which are rare in collection, which are very old, which are authentic in the, so that ways I kind of prepared my value pie. Then we were also being taught the risk matrix. So you got to list the hazard. So as per my museum, I listed the hazard, the possible hazards, and what are the likelihood, what are the impact, and on that basis, the disaster risk will be decided. So it's all on the risk matrix. So for example, if there's an outbreak of fire, so we have a kitchen within the restaurant, and restaurant is just in the middle of the museum. So we also have old wiring. So there is an outbreak of fire. What would be what is the likelihood? So there are a possibility of likelihood, and it is at the bar of 5, I would say 4. What would be the impact? Absolutely 5. It's on the high level. So if that is the case, then the disaster is extreme, is at the extreme level. So likewise, I kind of listed the hazards. For example, earthquake, derailing, because most of the locomotives which are there in outdoor exhibits are all standing on the gauges, on the tracks. So if there's an earthquake or if there's any kind of shakiness, so derailing is possible to happen. So something like that. So all the hazards were being listed, and then accordingly likelihood, impact, and disaster risk is prepared. So that way we prepared ourselves. The next question which was being asked in our session was, can we manage risk and respond to disasters alone? So we were all confused, and we were like, no, absolutely not. There are other people who are involved. So we were being taught that visitors are there, vendors are there, informal settlements. For example, in my museum, we have slum areas just at the side of our museum. So absolutely, they can also treated like a stakeholder. So key stakeholders we often fail to identify. It's very important to identify them and consider while planning, because if you are planning that these are hazards which can happen, likelihood. So then simultaneously, one should be prepared for the stakeholders who can help us, who can be a great guide during the planning session would be great. Then the next exercise was to figure out the stakeholders right next to my museum. So I listed that how far the hospitals and medical centers who are there around my museum. My museum centers around a very, very high security area because it is all around the embassy. So we have all the embassies around the range. We have a fire station which is like around 3 kilometers from my museum, and we also have police station. So I knew this from the beginning, but through this exercise, I could now be able to logically think about it, that how far, if something happens, then how far I should be prepared for it. Preparedness is what is important. Then the stakeholders were also being listed on city level, site level, institution level. And it was being also prepared at high interest because, for example, the Ministry of Railways, the DDA, the traffic police, they are all high interest people and they are also high influence. But there are low interest people and high influence people. And they're also high interest but low influence. For example, visitors. So they have interest in the museum, but they would not have they would not have high influence. They would be on the low influence. So it's always important to demarcate and to list them as per these. So then you can put them as per their preparedness. Then we were also being asked that, you should create a connection chart. So I prepared a chart putting the Rail Museum at the center of it and putting all the internal and external stakeholders and how strongly we are connected to each other. For that matter, I also kind of put ICOM also. So There are some strong connections. There are informal links as well. And there are also conflicts. But luckily, in my scenario, there were no case of conflict. It was all strong connection, and there were some informal links. So we were being taught that it's important to put your informal links on the strong connection listing as well. So that would help in a way. So this was phase one. We were being taught literally about from the beginning till how should we react, how should we prepare, how should we train, how should we respond, and how it would be a recovery. Now, the next one was supposed to be a physical one, the second phase, which was supposed to be 2 weeks hands-on workshop. But unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we could not go to Philippines. It was being conducted in Philippines, but we could not. So we shifted, the course was shifted to the online form. And trust me that when we started off with the practical session, we were very confused that how are we going to do the role play? How are we going to do the simulation? How are we going to do it just sitting in front of the system? But then ICOM Farcolesia actually made it very easy, and it made us so, we were all actively involved into it. We were actually could understand that how one should respond if such emergency happens. So we were given, we were literally being given a situation wherein the earthquake was being affected to a museum, and we were given to different rooms, and we were given a role play. So one person was given director, for example, all those things. So we kind of did a tabletop exercise that involved a simulation of a disaster event that was being done through 3D videos. That's all. Thank you.
If I could invite Brian and Emma to also turn back on their video, their screen for our question and answer, and there have been lots of questions and responses to both. So I do apologize. We probably won't get through them all, but I just encourage everyone to maybe after the short break, or maybe we can go straight into the breakout rooms where there's more opportunity to maybe have conversations and ask questions. So yes, and I will stop now and ask questions. So if the first question, Brian and Jessica, if I can ask you, on the practical side, were you able to purchase conservation materials locally so that work could later be continued using these available materials?
Yeah, I mentioned that briefly in the presentation. Yes, we focused very much on finding locally available materials. We did bring in international standards like paraloid B72 and materials that would be used in Europe and America generally to show people these things. But then we would also go out into the market and find alternatives. So where we in the States might normally use acid-free tissue, we went and we found soft fabrics that can be used. We also did a module in some of the classes where we went and found all the glues we could find in the market, and then we spread them all out on plastic and compared them and looked at what would be a good alternative locally. So it was very much part of the approach of all of the courses, learning how to use your phone to do GPS instead of needing a special piece of equipment for it, things like that.
That's great. Deepakshi, you mentioned mapping out the physical hazards. Did you discuss mapping out the staffing hazards, for example, mental health, low staff availability, problems with stakeholders' involvement and such, and how to plan for those in your management plan?
Yes, Steph, it was the first thing which I did was there was no communication and coordination map in our organization. So it's very important to, if there's an emergency happening, so it's very important to know who should we coordinate, who should we communicate, and how should we coordinate with each other. So I kind of mapped out all those things, the low staff which is there, and how shall we go about it. So that was first thing which we did while I was doing this. And it was a task because it was a pandemic, so it was all through that only. I mean, we were just doing it online, and I was preparing because I knew the organization. Yeah.
Thank you. Brian and Jessica, what security, safety processes or procedures did you need to have in place for working in such a challenging area?
Those have changed over the years, depending on who's been sponsoring the projects. But with the Smithsonian, we have a security management plan in place. There are different levels of security within the Kurdistan region of Iraq versus traveling into portions of federal Iraq. So we live a pretty average life in Erbil. We have an apartment and travel back and forth. We have staff that take us back and forth to the institute where we work. If we're going to go out to Nimrud or to Mosul, to the museum, to do a field check, we employ security managers who make a determination as to what type of posture, if you will. If it's something that's needed to be more than just a regular vehicle, if the security experts need to be with us. But we do risk assessments before every trip of any length. I mean, if I'm there for a few days to check on something just in Erbil, it falls under a regular plan. But if we're there for a course or again for one of these site visits, we'll check in with our security apparatus at the Smithsonian, and then typically connect with in-country security partners that are contracted to perform risk assessments and then make recommendations. So we balance the risk and try to keep as low a profile as possible. We don't typically advertise when we're in country. We are careful about posting on social media, not just for the safety of those of us coming from outside of Iraq, but for our Iraqi colleagues as well. So you'll see that it's usually a week to 2 weeks removed after we've left. If we've been there for a month or two, you won't hear about it until we've been gone for a month or two.
Thank you. Deepakshi, what feedback did you get from the 16 participants after they implemented their projects?
We made a video, and it was a hard thing because everybody was like, it was an evolution in their own organization. And like I said, that I have implemented some of the things in my organization. Likewise, all the 16 other of them, they kind of implemented, which they thought they might have done it much before this course. So all of them have evolved in their own journey.
And I believe you built a network, you're still in touch?
With all of them, yes.
Thank you. Jessica and Brian, what happened with the heritage objects stolen by Western forces during the war? And there's in brackets a comment, I know of many soldiers that have objects as souvenirs taken during their participation in the war. It's obviously an international crime. So, and that is the question. So what happened with the heritage objects stolen by Western forces?
Brian, please go ahead.
Very briefly, it's not something that we work with. We do support as needed when the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, they have a team that works in recovery of these objects. At the Smithsonian in the States, we do teach US-based law enforcement about anti-trafficking and work to help our border patrol folks and our customs enforcement folks to be able to identify things that are coming into the country illegally. But at the Institute, we're focused on specifically on heritage conservation and skills. It's not that we avoid the topic at all, but it's not something certainly that we're there to teach. We're always available for support and to help answer questions or make connections as needed. But really, the Iraqi government has that mission and is well connected in terms of international organizations and working on getting things repatriated and recovered.
Thank you. Deepakshi, did you talk to all the stakeholders about their interests and their influence? The person is interested in what their reactions was or were. Oh, is Deepakshi, that connection break off? I can't hear or see her. Deepakshi, you're back. Did you hear the question? Shall I repeat it?
Yes, I just heard half of it.
Okay, so the question was, did you talk to all the stakeholders about their interests and what was their influence? So the person is interested in the reaction of the stakeholders.
Like I said, I listed the stakeholders and I spoke to most of them. And it was a mixed reaction because some of them was like, okay, they were expecting that it should have been cordial from the day one, but somehow to getting them on board was not an easy task. But yes, I spoke to most of the stakeholders, and they were very happy to be on the board in any of the ways.
That's great. Thank you. Brian and Jessica, from the experience in Iraq, what learning experience did the Smithsonian receive from the Iraq group, specifically about local resources? Did you learn about regional materials that can be used in neighboring countries? But you already answered a little bit to that, so I guess in general that can maybe be expanded on what the learning was for the Smithsonian.
Yeah, I would say what I learned in particular, and I think all of our colleagues, let me step back one moment. One thing I didn't mention in detail is that much of our training is done by people who come to teach short sections of the course. 2 or 3 call them the lecturers come in. So Brian and I aren't doing all the training. We actually bring in a lot of experts to do that training. And I think what all of us have learned and have taken in is to be both practical and resourceful with whatever you can find to do the work, that there's always a solution, and thinking more broadly about how cultural heritage can be preserved and less about not specific techniques and not specific ways that it has to be done is something I know that I learned from the Iraqis, because they've had to adapt through so many tough times.
Thank you. And Deepakshi, what types of communication strategies were taught or explored during the course?
One was the role play, which I discussed. It was all we were doing role play. We were also doing multiple questionnaires. We were also given a breakout rooms where one was being sent to thinking of a scenario that there was a situation where one is stuck in a medical aid, the other likewise. So role play, all those interactive sessions which we could think of. Yeah.
Thank you. And Brian and Jessica, what were your greatest lessons learned through the many years of this program? How has it changed or developed over time?
We're both hesitating. That's a very large question, and we probably another week of conferences to talk about it. I think it's for me personally, it's always been about the people who care so much about their heritage and being able to facilitate anything that we can do to help that process, to help them manage their heritage in a way that they are comfortable with. And I think trusting those partners to do things using local technologies and materials and is something that took a while for me to get away from something, the kind of the best of the best, and to think more about how important it is to be able to do the work using good and better approaches, and not always just the best. So that's something that I've learned and continue to learn every time I go back.
I think I would add to that, I completely agree, but I would also add that to make change in these kinds of situations, especially in places like Iraq, where there's always some difficulty happening there. You need to stick with it. So you can't go in and do a 2-week course and expect that there's going to be any real change in how people can do their jobs or the way they think about their jobs. It needs to be a broader, longer approach to training. And I think that also shows in our colleague's presentation that you can't do it with one quick idea about what you're going to teach somebody. You have to think about how to teach it in different ways, and it's going to take you some time to do it.
Thank you. Deepakshi, what mitigation strategies did you explore or discuss for the hazards identified for the course?
Mitigation, we were being taught the capacities. We were being asked to explore our capacities. So our capacities were that we had the director, for example, is one of the person who was very open to the topic of coming up with the DRM plan. We were also being given a list of stakeholders who were very, for example, Ministry of Railways. They were very, so all the mitigation strategies were being done after that.
Okay, and that leads quite nicely to the next question for Brian and Jessica. Capacity building has been stressed a lot in this conference, but real capacity must include pay. Are there sufficiently paid employment opportunities along with training for Iraqi recruits, BSI staff, and other projects discussed this week?
I think the short answer is yes. I mean, we work primarily with people who are employed by the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, which is the federal government of Iraq's heritage bureau, and with their counterparts in the Kurdistan region, which is a region, a semi-autonomous region, which is in federal Iraq. So we're working with employed heritage professionals already. Certainly, I think every country could use more heritage specialists, and so making sure that there's more opportunities for employment is important. But we've been able to build a pretty big network of past participants, past students who have gone on to larger roles and more responsibility and keeping track of people. And a large portion of their participants are still in the heritage field and still working in these positions. I should note that in Iraq, there's only a very fledgling and nascent nonprofit and private heritage industry. There just simply are not particularly many opportunities that you would find in other countries to work for NGOs or in private consultancy. And so those areas, I think, are something that could be expanded upon in the future. But for now, the bulk of who we work with are either heritage employees or people they're in university or just graduated from university seeking employment.
Thank you. And Deepakshi, one last question. How did you get involved with the project, or what was literally very practically, how did you get involved or your organization with the project? You mentioned Call Asia, but was that a call for projects or participants, or was there an approach?
So there was a call for participation. It was for the participants. It was being circulated through ICOM site as well and through the mail also. So if you enroll yourself for the regular checkups on the events and news, you can get that.
Thank you. And thank you to all three of you. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your experience and your tips and your expertise. Thank you so much. Well, I've been kind of allowed to do the closing remarks for today. Very big responsibility and task. But I think what I would take from today really is, again, what was also reflected yesterday, people, and maybe building on from that, unsurprisingly, for the day that focused on training, really people and training in practice. I believe that a lot of the talks we heard today really emphasized the in-person. And I think the last talk or the last session, Brian and Jessica had this wonderful slide at the end of their talk, which I think summarized some of these aspects, the in-person work, the long-term commitment. I thought that was also very striking. Everything that needs to be done is really a long-term view and not just the firefighting or the silo work. It is the long-term view, the partnerships, a lot of collaboration. One person, two people can't do as much as many hands, many people. And again, I think that reflects quite nicely what came out yesterday, also to involve maybe communities, especially on the ground, and maybe people who are not the specific qualified, trained conservators. So people all have a lot to contribute if they work for the different organizations. So partnership, collaboration, but also I think leading by example, again, that goes into the opportunity with training that is in practice in the field, really going through scenarios, and that leading by practice, I believe, is very significant as well. It's a different thing to telling people what they have to do or what's the right thing to do than to maybe demonstrate it in practice. And working locally, that's also something, because some project, some risk assessment, some way how an organization or maybe even a region has reacted or has responded to certain disasters and emergencies, that might not work for another locality for many reasons. So I think the locality involving those people, there's also a lot of experience there. That's also really significant. And those are just some thoughts really that I think reoccurred to me a lot through the day. And they also, I like to mention them because they also really remind me a lot of what defines sustainable development, the United Nations Agenda 2030. And I think the 3 Ps really, which is people, partnership, and I would even add peace to that, because I do think that through the training, bringing different people together, working collaboratively, it is a wonderful way of bringing people together towards a common goal. And that's really my kind of closing remarks. I'm sure you will all have your own closing remarks for today. And I just want to say a big thank you, talking about partnership and collaboration, to the whole team that's been involved today in the working in the background, collating the questions, and Prince Media for the technical support, also for our speakers. And a big thank you again to our speakers who gave their time and were so generous in sharing their experience and their knowledge. And to all of you for joining us and for asking the questions. And I do encourage you to log on tomorrow and the day after, where the theme will continue with preparedness and recovery. Not preparedness, response and recovery. And I think that will be also a wonderful way in concluding these 4 days. So with that, I hope you all have a lovely evening or rest of the day or a good night, and hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you and bye-bye.